is no question that it is the action of young people in communities across the globe that has brought urgency to the climate crisis and a demand for increased accountability. Young people have been the world's conscience, fighting to end the systems that put profit above people and planet. And our spotlight interview is with one such youth leader, an extraordinary young woman from Uganda, the climate activist Vanessa Nakate. Inspired by Greta Thunberg to start her own climate movement in Uganda, Vanessa began a solitary strike against inaction on the climate crisis in January 2019, after witnessing droughts and devastating flooding in communities across her country. For many days, she was the lone protester outside the gates of the Parliament of Uganda in Kampala, a sole voice to begin with, but her message gathered momentum and support, which in turn led to her founding of the Youth for Future Africa and the Rise Up movement, both dedicated to environmental justice on her home continent. Vanessa has also started the Green Schools Project, a renewable energy initiative, and an incredible example of the creative and innovative thinking in which we all need to be actively engaged and enabling. Vanessa is a UN Young Leader for the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as being named as one of the BBC's Global 100 Women of the Year 2020, and in February this year was named as one of Time magazine's 100 Time Next cohort. Vanessa has challenged all leaders to leave their comfort zones and see the danger we are in and do something about it. So let's take up that challenge today. Welcome, Vanessa, and thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
So first of all, Vanessa, can you just share with us a little bit about your kind of awakening to the climate crisis and your journey to becoming part of the climate strikes movement, as well as the work that you're doing now. But tell us where it all began for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. My journey started in 2018. It was at the time that I started to carry out research to understand the challenges that the people in my community and in my country, Uganda, were facing. And of course, I found a number of challenges, but I was really surprised to find that the climate crisis was one of those challenges and actually the greatest threat facing our lives right now. I remember in school studying about climate change, but I didn't get the education about the reality of what was happening right now. It was more of, the theory of what climate change is and, what we can do about it. And it felt like it was something that we wouldn't have to worry about, something that would come in the far future or something that already happened. So we were safe. And my research was showing me the reality of what was happening right now and some of the impacts that I got to discover. I had already seen and watched on the news, like, the floods, the landslides. I had seen these things unfolding in Uganda, and I hadn't connected them to the climate crisis. So it was at this moment that I, decided to start striking for the climate. And my very first climate strike was in the first week of January 2019.
Okay, and tell us about that, because I think initially it was just you. I mean, you took that kind of quite a bold step to decide to actually take that action yourself. It's one thing to care passionately about something, but to actually say, no, I'm going to go and do something about this. That was quite a brave thing to do. I mean, how did that feel in the moment when you did that?
Yes, when I found out that the climate crisis was really affecting the people in my country, I started to look for ways on how to, help the people in my community. And it was that time that I got to find out about the Fridays for Future that was started by Greta. And I was really inspired by Greta to also start striking for the climate in my country. However, I didn't start striking immediately because I was extremely scared to go to the streets. I was extremely scared to face many people on the streets, as naturally I'm quite a shy person, and it was hard for me to just stand on the streets and have everyone's attention on me. So it took me a time to actually start striking for the climate, and that's why I ended up starting my climate strikes in the first week of January 2019. And my very first climate strike was actually on a Sunday. I remember it was a Saturday, and it was at this moment that I realized that I had taken so much time without doing the climate strikes because I was scared, and I just decided to, face the people, to face the public, and to expect whatever response I was going to expect, regardless of, what I was feeling at that time. So I decided to do the climate strike that week, but then I realized that I'd actually already missed the Friday strike since it was Saturday. So my very first strike was on a Sunday. Like I said, I felt like I had taken so much time, and yet a lot had to be done and a lot had to be said. And I remember that Saturday evening speaking to my siblings and some of the cousins who had visited at home, telling them about the climate strike and asking them if they could join me. And that Saturday night, we made a number of placards. And on Sunday, we went to do the climate strike. We actually struck in 4 different locations. Again, like I said, I felt like we had taken, so much time, and a lot of time had been wasted without me starting the climate strikes. So that is how the climate movement really started in my country, with my siblings and my cousins, when we went to different locations within Kampala to demand for climate justice.
And how, I mean, it's incredible just to think of taking that step, and I hear that sense of urgency that you felt in terms of taking that action. But how was it before other young people started joining you?
It actually took quite a long time. After that first strike, with my siblings, I remember they had to prepare for school, and my cousins had to go back to their homes. So I had to either, invite young people to join me for the climate strikes, and was basically looking at the people who had been at school with. And of course, I reached out to a number of them and told them where I will be holding my climate strike. In Bugolobi, that is like a small town within Kampala. And I remember going to the strike that day on Friday, the following week, and standing there for like 30 minutes, and no one had sent me a message, no one had called, no one had told me that they were on their way. But we, in the next, half hour, a friend showed up, and I was surprised that he actually showed up, and we stood there for more 30 minutes, and then we marched to another stage as we were holding the strike placards. He could join me sometimes in the strikes, but other times he couldn't, until when he finally had to go back to school, and school was really far away from where we would do the climate strikes. So that's the time that I continued to do the strikes by myself. And getting other young people to really join, I think that really started to happen around October, when I was really telling my friends that I've been doing this for months, and this the climate crisis is affecting not just my future but also your future, and we are already seeing the impacts even in our present life. So you have to join me so that we can demand for a future that is healthy, a future that is livable, a future that is sustainable for all of us. And at that point, those who were willing to join said that they couldn't, because they felt like the climate movement was mainly for young people, was mainly for teenagers. At that time, if you remember, the media would report climate movement led by teenagers. Teenagers in Europe lead the climate movement, or in the United States. So many of them felt like this was a movement for teenagers, and we were in our early 20s, just after college. And that's the time I asked them if we can form a group and call ourselves Youth for Future. So we can call ourselves Youth for Future, but then continue to do the climate strikes. And Some of them really identified with being called Youth for Future, than feeling like they would be a part of the movement, but then the media will be reporting teenagers, and yet they are not teenagers. So that's when we started Youth for Future, and many of my friends started to join the climate strikes. Sometimes some of them would do their own strikes in the places where they were staying. But even before that, I had started going to schools to speak to students about climate issues, and also sometimes during the climate strikes, with them within the schools. It's not easy for us to hold the big large strikes that we see in Europe or we see in the United States. The situation is much more complicated for us. So in that time, I would visit the schools and speak to students and, chant with them and organize with them within the schools. And this is something that continued and became much easier when some of my friends joined Youth for Future, because now I didn't have to, go to the schools by myself, and I didn't have to do all the work by myself. So we were sharing all the work and, working together. And in January this year, that's when we, decided to, sorry, not this year, last year, 2020, that's when we decided to change the name from Youth for Future to Rise Up Movement. So now we identify ourselves as Rise Up Movement, but the origin of Rise Up Movement is actually Youth for Future.
Amazing. It's incredible. And it's, I suppose it just shows that, I mean, and we've seen this so often, but sometimes it just takes one person to stand up, and the others will then say, okay, well, if they've been brave enough to do it, I will do it also. But it takes a lot. I suppose I'm just really, I find it very moving, that idea of you and your, one friend or a couple of friends just saying, no, we're going to keep doing this. It's an incredible thing. And it's led now to amazing things. I mean, tell us about the work that you're leading now and that you're involved in now.
Yeah, thank you so much. Some of the work that I have really been working on, especially with the Rise Up movement, we've been, of course, joining the climate strikes every Friday and organizing the global climate strikes in Uganda. And we've continued to reach out to schools and educate students and carry out, climate education within the schools, so that students really understand what the climate crisis really is, so that students really understand their connection to nature and the part, that they can play to, help make this world a better place for everyone. However, when the pandemic started, most of that work in the schools was put on hold because we had to stay at home, and also schools were closed during that period, and then they were open for a short while, but again they are closed again. So we kind of stopped doing the reach outs in schools, but we've also organized reach outs in communities to speak to the people about climate issues. Not everyone will understand the IPCC report. Not everyone will understand 1.5, especially in these communities. But when we speak to people in communities and explain to them how the climate crisis affects their access to food, how the climate crisis is going to affect their water sources, and they will struggle to find something to eat and struggle to find water, to drink or for their own home use. Many people understand, how they can be able to to work within their communities to educate more people about what is really happening. And the other thing is the Ash Green Schools project, which you talked about. And this involves the installation of solar panels and eco-friendly stoves in schools. And this was started because I wanted to drive a transition to renewable energy in the schools in Uganda. We talk a lot about how we must transition to renewable energy, but not everyone is able to access it. Not everyone is actually able to afford it. So through the Vash Green Schools project that receives support or donations from different people, we are able to make these installations possible. We are able to put these solar panels in the schools, and also we are able to provide the eco-friendly cookstoves. In my country, almost every school uses firewood for preparation of food. So that means many trees are really cut down so that schools can use as a form of firewood. And the eco-friendly stoves, they do not completely eliminate the use of firewood, but they greatly reduce on the amount of firewood that schools use in the preparation of food. So those are some of the things that we've really been working on. We've also been working on campaigns like Stop ECOP, that is the East Africa crude oil pipeline that is to be constructed, in East Africa. We believe that we cannot have, any pipeline construction within a climate emergency. When it feels like we won't be able to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees, then we cannot allow any construction of new coal power plants or construction of new oil pipelines, because at the end of it all, we cannot eat coal and we cannot drink oil.
And it's a really powerful, I've seen you sort of in your placards and so on social media, I've seen that, a really strong message. And so tell me then, Vanessa, from that work that you've done in your own country, you've also, that's, incredible enough, but you're also now doing huge amounts at an international level, the work with the UN, you've been to New York, you've been to Davos. How did that happen, and what has it been like being involved in those international experiences?
Yeah, I remember when I started activism, actually for like 7 or even more months, I had no idea that there existed climate conferences. I didn't know anything about these things. So I didn't know about the COP, I didn't know about youth climate summits. I didn't even know that these things were held in different parts of the world. And how it really happened for the Youth Climate Summit, I received an invitation to attend the Youth Climate Summit in New York, and I was honestly surprised, and I felt happy because it felt like people were actually watching what I was doing, and yet I thought people were not watching what I was doing. So it really felt great to meet many other climate activists in New York, and also when I went for the COP25 in Madrid, it was also great meeting other activists, and the same thing in Davos, because these are places of we always organize online, but in these places you get to meet in person, you get to organize together, you get to mobilize together, you get to speak and understand the challenges that people are facing in their countries, you get to understand the actual stories that are people are facing in specific communities. I may understand exactly what I'm seeing in my country, Uganda, but I may not have a full picture. I may not have a bigger picture of what is happening in Kenya, or what is happening in Nigeria, or what is happening in Europe, or what is happening in Asia. But when I meet an activist, from those specific, places, from different parts of the world, I'm able to hear their story and understand why they are protesting, why they are demanding for, justice from the government leaders. Because every activist has a story to tell, and every story has a solution to give, and every solution has a life to change. So some of these invitations that I've got to these conferences, I've always been told, we've been monitoring your work, and we see how you've been demanding for climate justice, and powerfully speaking truth to power, and demanding leaders to listen to the science. Yeah, basically that is what I'm always told when I get some of these invitations. And being there, the experiences are always wonderful to meet other climate activists. Activism is not an easy journey. I can say it's not an easy thing to do, but when I know that there is an activist in this place, if I need a time to rest and to take some time off, I know that another activist is speaking up, and if they need time to rest, they know that I can also speak up for the same thing. So it has always been a great experience to meet with different activists from across the world.
Yeah, that's incredible, and that sense of community as well, in terms of what you're kind of talking about. And I mean, just thinking about, I mean, this event that the IoD is kind of hosting is very much focused on leaders and those who are in charge in organisations. And, we have to, if we're talking, across the kind of the generations, I suppose, in some ways, we've seen so often, as you've said, that young people and young leaders talking to those in power. I mean, what do you think that leaders and those who sit around the boardroom tables in companies and businesses, what do you think they need to do right now?
I think that they need to listen to the science, because the science is very clear. We are in a climate emergency. We are in a climate crisis. We face a challenge of not limiting global temperatures to 1.5 degrees because of the continuous burning of fossil fuels, because of the continuous rise in global temperatures. I can say that at 1.2 degrees, it is already hell for us. It is already hell for communities in my country, communities across Africa, communities across the global south. It's important to know that we may all be facing the same storm of the climate crisis, but we are definitely in different boats. Those at the front lines of the climate crisis are least responsible for the emissions that we are seeing. Historically, Africa is responsible for only 3% of global emissions, and yet Africans are already suffering some of the most brutal impacts fueled by the climate crisis. Talk about the floods, talk about the landslides, talk about the droughts, talk about the cyclones that have destroyed and ravaged vast parts of the African continent and destroyed many people's livelihoods. So the climate crisis is here now at 1.2 degrees. But then the scientists warn that if nothing is done right now, we won't be able to keep or limit the global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. So the report, the IPCC report that came out scares me to think that if we cannot limit 1.5, and yet 1.2 degrees is already hell for many communities, how worse is it going to get if leaders don't do anything about this? So I think that what leaders need to do is to listen to the science, to listen to the activists, especially activists from the most affected communities who are seeing the impacts of the climate crisis right now. And also to add that when leaders listen to the science, we want them to take real action now. Leaders many times talk about halving emissions by 2030, by 2040, or going net zero by 2030 or 2040, but they allow for more decades of environmental destruction. They talk about net zeros of 2030 while opening up new coal power plants. They talk about net zeros of 2040 while constructing new oil pipelines. If we are to really limit global temperatures to 1.5, if we are to see meaningful action from the leaders, not empty summits, not empty promises, not empty sweet talks, action has to start now, not in 2030.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of that, when you're speaking to leaders or you are part of young people speaking to leaders, do you think leaders are listening to young people? What's that experience like when you're in these rooms in Davos and so on? I mean, what's it like? Do the leaders listen to young people?
I think that the leaders can hear young people, they can see young people demanding for action, but they're actually not listening to us. Because I personally believe that when you listen to someone, then you react or, you take action, to what they are saying or to what they are demanding for. I may be speaking and you're hearing me, but then it feels like I'm actually making noise for you and you're trying to block that noise. But when you listen, you quietly pay attention to what I'm saying and then you do what I'm demanding for. So I don't think that leaders are listening to youth activists yet.
Okay, it's a really powerful point, that the difference between hearing and listening is an incredibly powerful point. And obviously we're speaking to you from Scotland. The eyes of the world are going to be on Glasgow in November when COP26 is here. What would your message be to those who are attending COP26?
To the leaders?
Yeah. Yes.
I think it's something that I've already said. Just listen to the science and take the necessary action for the people and for the planet. It's time for leaders to put people above pipelines. It's time for leaders to put communities above coal power plants. And I think this really starts from listening to the science. It really starts from understanding that we cannot eat coal, we cannot drink oil, so we don't need anything from the fossil fuel industry, because it's causing and has already caused massive destruction of our communities, massive destruction of our homes, and also to listen to communities of the most affected people, and areas. So what I really expect from the leaders in Glasgow this year is to listen to the scientists, listen to the activists, especially from the most affected areas, listen to our stories and take meaningful action right now. We don't want to hear your sweet promises, because many times they end up being empty. We want to see real action being done right now. We also want leaders, to look at solutions that we know can work right now. Many times leaders will, talk about solutions that need massive investment, research, development, but there are solutions that we know can work right now. For example, educating girls. Project Drawdown lists 100 things that we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and ranked number 5 is educating girls on family planning. So it's important for leaders to understand that when we educate more girls, it means that we are not just it's not just the individual benefiting, but it also her family, her community, and also the planet. So it's time to consider solutions that we know can work right now, as they can think about those solutions that need more development and we don't even know when they'll be put in place. But it's time to find solutions that we know can work right now, and also help communities, especially communities in the global south, to transition to renewable energy.
Fantastic, wonderful, and that focus on girls is a great way for us to also think about these issues and think about how widespread some of the solutions are that we can bring to this as well. Vanessa, we've actually reached the end of our time together, but I'm really so delighted we're able to speak with you, and I'm really struck by that point that you made earlier about every story has a solution to give, and every solution can change a life. That's something that I'm going to be remembering from this conversation and taking forward in the work that we do with the IoD. So thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
This third and final panel reflection considers what we need to actually be doing to accelerate to net zero, and the role of directors and leaders in making it happen with more urgency and with more creativity. And we've got a really fantastic panel of speakers joining us, and I'm so grateful to each of them for giving up the time to join in this discussion. Each is an expert in their own field, so let me introduce you to Dr. Rachel Sibande, a digital development specialist working at the Digital Impact Alliance, who also established Malawi's first tech hub in 2014, and she's joining us from Pretoria today. Amee Ritchie, a young entrepreneur and innovator who developed and now sells a plastic-free recyclable water bottle made from plants, and it's called Sweet. Mark Logan, formerly Chief Operating Officer of Skyscanner and who, among numerous other roles, now leads the Scottish Government's implementation of the Technology Ecosystem Review, which looks to develop the country's tech sector and its infrastructure. And Samantha Suppiah, who is joining us from the Philippines. Samantha is a sustainability strategist focusing on addressing extreme inequality and climate change in the global south by reframing discussions away from an outdated colonial viewpoint to a local, empathetic, ecocentric way of thinking. So fantastic diversity on this panel in terms of their experience, and we're going to hear from each of them before we open it up for a panel discussion. So let me start first with Dr. Rachel Sibande. Rachel, you've got a close interest in the potential of big data and digital. So can you tell us, what do you see as the biggest opportunities and indeed the biggest challenges in this space? And where do you think sectors and big data could have the biggest impact in the race to net zero? So Rachel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Greetings from Pretoria, South Africa. It's a pleasure to be here with our listeners. To your question, where are the biggest opportunities? Where are the biggest challenges in this space? I want to start off by saying that what we see as the biggest challenges are actually the opportunities. So there's some equality there. And where should we be focusing on? I believe that we should be focusing on taking tangible action in making use of digital and data in a safe and responsible way towards achieving real change. How do we do that? I would like to highlight one particular area that we need to support and create incentives for innovators, for creators, for them to develop tangible digital solutions, tangible data solutions to solve some of these key social problems or global challenges like the issue of global warming. I believe we have talked enough and are already seeing the effects of global warming with the warmest years ever that have been registered, for example, in between 2015 and 2018. We've also seen global temperatures increasing recently by at least 1 degree Celsius. And this should actually continue to increase if no tangible actions are taken or supported. However, we do know that there are a lot of startups springing up globally, both in the replica of Silicon Valley cities in Europe, in the Middle East, but even here in Africa. And there is an opportunity there for us to leverage these innovation hubs, these young innovators, these startups who are creating solutions to some of these biggest challenges. And so the opportunity there is to invest, create incentives in these startups, in these innovators, to generate solutions that can actually be scaled up in solving some of these global challenges that we are facing currently. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel. And actually, we're going to come back to those themes, I'm sure, throughout this discussion as well. So now I'm going to come to you, Amee, and you've got creative. You're one of these young innovators that we've been talking about and shifted from kind of talking the talk to walking the walk. So tell us a bit about what motivated you to kind of start production of your plastic-free water bottle. And also, if you could you sort of touch on what message you would give to young leaders who might have a kind of idea but are unsure how to bring it to market in particular? And I suppose that does speak to kind of Rachel's piece about how do we kind of create opportunities for innovation. I mean, what was that like for you? So over to you, Amee.
Thanks, Louise. Yes, so we at Sweet created reusable water bottles out of plant-based materials. So we managed to create a durable plastic-like material made solely from plants using bamboo and wheat straw, which we've turned into the world's first reusable bottle made from plants. We came up with this idea during our time at college and university after seeing how many single-use plastic bottles were wasted during lunchtime and finding out that many students struggled to find a reusable water bottle just because they would become smelly, they'd be difficult to clean, they could be easily broken, and that led them to throwing them away after a few months of use. So that's why we decided to create something that was easy to clean, naturally antibacterial, functional, and truly sustainable. In regards to, younger entrepreneurs, I think that my message would be, if there's a young entrepreneur with an idea they'd like to bring to market, I think, focusing on their purpose and their vision, ensuring that their idea is meaningful, which would mean it won't be wasteful, and is always aligning with that overall purpose. I'd also encourage entrepreneurs to keep sustainability at the forefront of every decision, working towards things like B Corp registration, carbon neutral production, give back programs. All of these things can be amazing ways of doing this.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thanks, Amee. And yeah, good mention about B Corp status as well. So again, one for us to come back to. So thank you for that. Mark, I'm going to come to you now. I mean, you've been involved in leading so much technology-led innovation, including advising governments. So when you're thinking about this kind of question about accelerating to net zero and the role of kind of technology and innovation in that, could you maybe share from your perspective, similarly, I suppose, to what we asked Rachel, about what are the opportunities and the challenges from your perspective in the work that you've done?
Sure. Hi, Louise. Well, we're talking about moving from talking the talk to walking the walk. And I think my opening question in response is, well, why haven't we already? Why haven't we taken those opportunities and addressed those challenges that you mentioned? System scientists talk about a pathology called the tragedy of the commons, where individuals selfishly exploit a shared resource and pass the consequences and damage from that exploitation to everybody else. And it's a very difficult pathology to break out of, because that asymmetry of short-term benefit and apparently no proportional corresponding consequences is very, very seductive. And the reason why we are not acting as a species right now is because we are caught in an enormous, almighty tragedy of the commons as regards climate. So here we are in 2021, and 80% of our primary fuel sources on Earth are still fossil fuel based. So, question is, what do we do now? The longer we stay in this tragedy of the commons, the more and more unpalatable these solutions become. So it's natural to turn to the tech industry and hope for some salvation there. And while I think the tech industry undoubtedly contains the seeds of our solutions, I think we also need to just soberly reflect that right now, on aggregate, the tech industry is a net accelerator of carbon consumption, not alleviator. For example, we're using new technologies to access oil wells that were previously uneconomic. We celebrate, and where I've spent my time in tech in the digital space, we celebrate blockchain as a technology, for example, but its first major application, Bitcoin, uses more electricity than a typical European country. So we're going in many ways in the wrong direction in that regard. I think we have to recognize that we're at war now with our own path dependence, at war with our sunk costs, our vested interests, our lobbying groups, our failure to apprehend what exponential decline really looks like. And I think if we're going to win that war, it requires a wartime level response. And that really means that governments in all the countries that can afford to do it need to lead in a very, very aggressive way that response in partnership with our digital and tech industries to bring forward in a far faster rate the exploitation of existing technologies. So I'm here in the UK. I can't find the car charging network for electric cars anywhere except in the most embryonic form. To bring forward nascent technologies at a much faster rate, such as green hydrogen and carbon capture, and even to bring forward solutions that seem decades away, like fusion, for example. And we know we can do these things because we saw with, for example, the vaccine response to COVID, that governments can act in conjunction with industry very rapidly. Before that, we even saw the American government spend 5% of its GDP landing on the moon, 1% of its annual defence budget would decarbonise all the homes in America, as an example. So I think that massive wartime level response now is what's required. And I fear, as many of us do, that it's already too late to win that war and to save our children from catastrophe, but it's certainly not too early to get started.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Mark. Lots in there for us to explore in our discussion. And Samantha, let me come to you now, joining us from Manila today. So there's no question the Global South has paid a really heavy price for decisions made in the Global North. So from your perspective, where would you again see these kind of challenges and opportunities? But also, could you outline a wee bit about your philosophy that informs the work that you're doing as well?
Thank you, Louise. Thank you all. I love how we're talking about this with very little emotion. Let me start off by saying I'm not interested in a net zero world. I'm interested in a just world. I am a product of the British Empire in Southeast Asia. I was born into a westernized, colonized nation that celebrates the arrival of the British. The surprisingly oppressive city-state of Singapore continues its power and money hoarding because of the colonial corporate relationships they maintain, not least with the City of London. Singapore today is one of the world's most unequal and unsustainable places. That does not stop it from marketing itself as a sustainable garden city where everybody is rich and happy and nobody ever cries. In reality, it is a police state with a highly suppressed, commodified culture that is run by global North corporate overlords. Singapore is not a nation with citizens, it is a corporation with employee consumers. Global North businesses love Singapore. It is a comfortable and convenient place from which to safely exploit Southeast Asia. #greenwashing. Myself, I studied, worked, and lived in Scotland, England, and Sweden as a sustainability consultant, mostly in building and urban design. I returned to Southeast Asia in early 2020, and I'm speaking to you now from lockdown in Metro Manila, which is the engine of colonial hegemony in the Philippines. In the last couple of years, I started up 3 projects: the Global Room, Urban Donut, and Possible Futures. I have links and a bunch of references for everyone, actually, at bit.ly/purple burglar alarm. That's bit.ly/purple burglar alarm. I am a design strategist for real sustainability and regeneration. Real sustainability does not perpetuate ecocide or ethnocide. Real regeneration seeks to undo ecocide and ethnocide. I am in opposition to the UN Food Systems Summit, and I fully support the Global People's Summit on Food Systems led by agrarian justice activists across the Global South. I support the Liang Network, which advocates for Sabukahan unity of Lumad women who are indigenous, environmental, and human rights defenders in Mindanao's southern Philippines, a highly militarized region in the world's most important biodiversity hotspot. Indigenous communities there were first displaced en masse when Spanish colonizers arrived in the late 1500s, and they have been running ever since. Today, they run from mercenaries of big ag and big mining, who are supported by the World Bank and the Philippine government. This story is pretty much copy-paste right the way across the Global South. MNCs listening here are complicit in this. Clearly, you won't find any neoliberal optimism in my perspectives. I don't believe our hopium addiction will save us all. Hopium referring to a political narcotic co-optation of the left, distributed by vested economic interests. This is conscious capitalism in a nutshell. If we want to talk about collaborative action, we need to talk about restorative justice first. And I'm not talking about DEI color washing. I'm pointing to real sovereignty, self-determinism, just representation, and the return of stolen wealth. I would like to see in my lifetime the ethnocide of our contemporary globalized business culture. Collaboration where we work together to oppress others is not the kind of collaboration I want in our possible futures, and that could still be net zero. That's me. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you so much, Samantha. And I suppose that just illustrates actually the kind of the complexity that when we start to kind of explore these issues, particularly at a system level, and everyone actually is in different ways has been talking about different elements of the system, but that kind of the way that things kind of then operate at system level, and when you then get into the kind of exploring that in depth, some of the real complexity and big questions that we need to ask ourselves in exploring these issues. So thank you to all of you for that. So much there actually. I've been taking notes as we've gone and as well. So lots for us to think about and explore. But so let me just start with just a couple of questions as well. Rachel, can you tell us a wee bit more about the M-Hub that you set up in Malawi? Because that was a bit of a blueprint for what you were talking about in terms of the technology, innovation and ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. So the M-Hub is Malawi's first technology and innovation hub. We champion the development of local technology solutions that solve social problems, but we also incubate and accelerate innovative entrepreneurs. These are young entrepreneurs that are developing solutions across the social spaces. It could be in waste management, it could be in the food value chain, but indeed even in this space of global warming that we're talking about today. It could be in the energy space. I mean, it's a whiteboard. We provide investment readiness support in the form of financing to help these entrepreneurs take their products and services to the market. We also provide them with coaching, mentoring, and market linkages so that these products and services that are as innovative as they are can actually scale to the market and solve real social problems that the world is facing.
How has climate change featured in the M-Hub? Has it been a factor? Has it been part of the work that you've done there?
Yes. Recently, we started off a program which we are calling the Modern Cooking and Healthy Forests Accelerator. This is a specific accelerator that is targeting young innovators and entrepreneurs who are producing solutions to solve some of the challenges that are being faced to ensure that we can reduce carbon emissions, to ensure that we can enhance fuel-efficient cooking technologies. Because as you might know, for a country like Malawi, majority of our forests, for example, are lost due to use of wood from the trees for domestic cooking. But also tobacco is the largest cash earner for Malawi as a country. And with flue-cured tobacco, smallholder farmers use non-efficient flue-curing tobacco barns where they cure the tobacco, which depletes over 65% of the forest cover. And as it burns, there's a lot of carbon emissions that are coming into the environment and the atmosphere. And so the challenge within this accelerator is to identify entrepreneurs that can create innovations to solve some of these problems to ensure that we are reducing the challenges that we face as a result of global warming. So we provide them with financing, coaching, mentoring, and support them with market linkages. So far, we have invested over $1.4 million only in the last 2 years to these innovative young entrepreneurs. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mark, let me come to you on that, because I mean, even that example about the destruction of the forests around some of these industries speaks to you a bit about that tragedy of the commons pathology, actually, in many ways, about that addiction, and that also ties very strongly to what Samantha was talking about at that system level. You've talked, I mean, you've obviously, you're somebody that is obviously keen on that systems thinking, and that's what you've brought to this, the work that you've done around technology as well. I mean, is there anything from what you've heard from your fellow panelists that's making you reflect on some of that thinking?
Yeah, I think the comments from several of our speakers today speak about our failure to apprehend that we're in a system and the way we act in a very localized way within that system with often tragic consequences. And I think people find it hard to think in terms of systems, but we've really got to start doing that. We're talking about climate change today, but in Britain, for example, since 1970, we've lost 3/4 of our insect population, for example. And 1970 wasn't when it all started, that by 1970 we'd already lost 3/4 of it, and now we've lost another 3/4 of what's left. We're not thinking in a system way at all. In Britain we often lambast other governments for burning down rainforests. I come from Scotland. I'm sure you've all seen the beautiful pictures of the tree of the mountains and so on. There's no trees on those mountains because we've already burnt down all our trees, and we think that's normal. And we still burn them down for people to go grouse shooting. So we're not thinking in system terms. And I think individuals find it difficult to rise above their own role and think in system terms. It's only really governments that can do that. And, that's not just at national level, that has to be at international level. I'm very apprehensive as to whether or not we have the level of political capability in our leaders to take that challenge on. But in so many spheres of our ecosystem, we're out of time. We had the IPCC report published 3 weeks ago, and the day after, I don't know what it's like in other people's countries, but the day after it was published, it disappeared from most of our news sites here because it's inconvenient. And I'm very, very alarmed by that. So, system thinking is incredibly important, but we don't do it by default, and we very rapidly have to.
Yeah, and I suppose what I'm thoughtful about there is that we have innovation and creativity. We've got it on this panel. All of you will have seen fantastic projects wherever you are in terms of work to address this. Often community-led. Very often it's kind of by people kind of coming together. And that kind of community focus, or it can be innovation through whether it's startups and so on. And there's an interesting dimension, isn't there, about the kind of the creativity that we kind of try and foster through that innovation meeting the system itself. Does that make sense? I mean, Amee, tell us about when you had this idea. How easy was it to get started, or were you even aware that there was a system that you could connect with? Or, I mean, again, your reflections on this kind of conversation from your perspective.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when we first started, so that was back in 2018, and I think the conversation about climate change was there, but definitely not as big as it is right now. And I think, first starting out with no experience behind us, no finance behind us, and we were really lost on where to go, actually. I think being in Scotland, we're very fortunate that there is a lot of organisations, grant support, financial support, mentors available. But it did take us, I would say, 2 years to access all of that and to, learn where those opportunities are. But again, I would say, sometimes you can only go so far as a small business, and as a young entrepreneur, we can do our best and try to make the change internally, which we do, but we of course need government support in that as well, worldwide. But I think supporting entrepreneurs through grant funding, mentorship, and just also listening to the younger generation's ideas, listening to what they have to say, and they're much more environmentally focused than older generations. So I think just, being collaborative and taking that on and going forward with it, not just sitting back and listening, but actually pushing forward.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. And Samantha, coming back to you, I mean, I suppose I'm quite kind of fascinated in that, your experience in sort of building and urban design, and quite often design can be seen as something that's just kind of, the word's not superficial, but, I'm not sure that everybody understands the kind of the depth of work around sort of systems that can go, when you're talking about that kind of field and that kind of work. I suppose it's that sense of when you start talking about design and you start using design thinking, you quite quickly then, you have to kind of look at systems, really, don't you? Because you're actually kind of unpicking those. So do you think that creativity around design thinking? Tell us what you think it's got to contribute to this kind of space and this work.
Yeah, I think design is about, essentially, it's applied systems thinking. And so the perspectives that designers are holding become very important when we're thinking about how then the outcomes turn out, right? And I've heard some, pretty sort of concerning opinions, for example, especially in the West, around how climate change came about or how we became unsustainable as a species. And it's very much this messaging that it's all our fault, it's all of humanity's fault, when obviously that is not the case. There is a certain part of humanity that made all the money from the exploitation of the planet, and there is a certain part of humanity, 85% actually, that suffered the consequences of that. So for me, it's about understanding actually our cultural evolution from a civilizational point of view. This global civilization was really kickstarted by the post-war period's age of the Great Acceleration. I'm sure you might have already heard of this. This is the dramatic, continuous, and roughly simultaneous surge in growth rate across a large range of measures of human activity, which is often indicated as starting in the 1950s and going strong today because it is protected by institutions such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and the City of London. It is within this context that we are talking about so-called innovation, so-called creativity, and so-called business. And this is the one world that we point to in Possible Futures. This is a world that seeks to eliminate, exterminate, to eat other worlds. There is nothing else that you can talk about because it is not deemed as legitimate. And so we are really talking about power here. We're talking about being a social species on a social planet. Relationality is everything. Power, politics, and governance are embedded in the ways that ecosystems, natural or human, evolve and grow. So we have to reckon with it. This is what we have to understand when we're talking about design, because we're designing for humans. We have to look at intersectionality, which is about recognizing and acknowledging our unique, complex realities. This is what business is really supposed to be. And it got turned into something completely different, right? So this way of being able to see the long story, in futures, we sometimes talk about, if you want to look 30 years into the future, you have to look 30 years back in the past. I think if you want to look 30 years into the future, you have to look 3,000 years into the past. There's so much about humanity and its cultural evolution and the different, diverse cultures within humanity that kind of have their own ebbs and flows, etc. And if we're not understanding what perspectives we are placing onto how we design, then we're just going to perpetuate the exact same thing. It's the same world, same system. Nothing changes.
So, yeah, it's back to that that kind of tragedy of the commons kind of idea as well that we talked about. And I mean, around, I suppose what I'm thoughtful about, Samantha, is where then, there clearly is a kind of a movement, quite a lot of it led by young people as well. There's clearly a kind of a sense of people saying, no, we have to, this has to stop. We have to do what we can. There's lots of people making lots of effort, lots of, creativity and whatever, and human spirit going into that. I mean, where do you see the seeds of hope in that?
I don't.
You don't.
What I hear from a lot of the youth climate activists is more of the same. They are unable to really imagine. In fact, a lot of the youth activists across the global south are actually westernizing themselves because they have to align with the movement, or they want to align with the movement, without realizing that they're essentially giving up their own traditional cultures, which are actually the one thing that can take us back into a place where we can actually start to regenerate the different bioregions where we are, because there is such a thing as ecological biodiversity, hence there is such a thing as human cultural diversity. These things are very tightly intertwined. So I don't see the hope in the youth, actually. I do see the hope in the fact that indigenous peoples around the world are starting to get more self-organized, so better coordinated, and because of the pandemic as well, they're able to reach more people and speak about de-civilization. The one movement that I do think, and it's not a youth-led movement, the one movement that I do think I'm hopeful for is the decolonization movement. This is particularly centered upon decolonizing the mind, which is again going back to what perspectives are we holding as designers of businesses, of organizations, of supply chains. What perspectives are we holding? And how do we make sure we're not repeating the same problems?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is such a powerful question, actually, that what perspectives are we holding? And Rachel, let me kind of come back to you. I mean, we're approaching a few weeks away from COP26 coming to Glasgow in Scotland. What's your, I suppose, do you have a message or a wish or a hope from that event happening in a few weeks' time?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. My message is simple. I think we've spoken a lot. All talk is cheap, like Mark had also said earlier. Let us start to invest more into tangible solutions, tangible actions to start solving the problem. Because meanwhile, it's getting warmer. We're getting more emissions into the atmosphere. We are not improving significantly as much as we should in as regards as issues of global warming are concerned. So I would really love to see a focus on supporting or investing in creators, innovators of solutions that can be scaled up to make the change and the difference. Let us move away from all talk to more action.
Yeah. And where do you have hope, or where do you see the seeds of hope?
For me, though, I think a little, diversion from Samantha's. I see hope in our young people. I see hope in the young creators. I see a lot of hope in indigenous knowledge. There is an opportunity there if we are to provide the necessary support that, some of the best solutions would come from there. There's nothing new, really, that I see would come up, because it's not like we have to reinvent the wheel to come up with most of these solutions. So I'm super hopeful that there is an opportunity if we do empower and engage our young innovators, our young solution providers to help us in creating some of the change that we want to see. I also see hope in the narrative around creating a mindset change. It's very important because all this is about mindset change, as Samantha had also highlighted. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. And Mark, your message or your hopes for COP26 in Glasgow, what are you hoping to see from the leaders there?
I've got pretty low expectations for COP26. I think more widely, if you want to break out of a tragedy of the commons scenario, there's kind of two things that have to happen. One is that people have to experience the consequences of their exploitation in a much more timely manner. And we have been living in the comfort that we're visiting our damage upon our grandchildren, which doesn't say much for us as a species, but that's how we've been living. Recently, we've started to experience the consequences of that exploitation firsthand. So we've had some terrible so-called natural disasters around the world in just the last few weeks. I think we need to reflect on how do we bring forward the catastrophe that's to come so we can experience what that's going to mean. Now, how do we do that? Do we do that through, visualization, through depicting everyone's local neighborhood in 30 years' time? Or I'm hoping that some of these recent catastrophes have concentrated the minds of world leaders a little bit more than has previously been the case. I'm hoping that, as a species, we are terrible at understanding exponentials. We think tomorrow will be a bit like today and the day after a bit like tomorrow. And we saw with COVID that actually exponentials do happen, and the first half of an exponential is flat and the second half is dizzyingly rapid in its change. I'm hoping that our awareness that's been brought to us through what COVID has done and is doing will make us a bit more conscious that climate change is going to be the same, but in a much, much more catastrophic scale, and we're out of time now. We're at the heel of that graph now. So I'm hoping that there's some sort of consciousness there. So one thing I'm hoping happens in summary is that we start to feel the future now, and that gives us some impetus, because we don't act as a species until we're almost out of time. I think the other thing that breaks out of a tragedy of the commons is to bring people the direct costs of their consumption. So I live in Scotland here. 95% of our electricity comes from wind power, which is great. Why is it that burning gas is still much, much cheaper in Scotland or in the UK than using electricity? We don't price in the external costs, the carbon damage of burning gas. So the only way we're ever going to change behaviours rapidly is to bring the costs of our consumption to us now to drive our behaviours. And as Rachel and Amee have demonstrated, there's a lot of ingenuity. We have the ability to invent our way out of problems, but it must be directed, it must be incentivised. And right now in Britain, we spend 32 times as much on fiscal stimulus for fossil fuel production than we do on green. So all the great work that our entrepreneurs are doing and could do is moot if we don't change those structures. And I do very much reflect on Samantha's points, which are very deep, as to whether or not our structures want to change, because they'll have to if we're to exploit that great ingenuity that the other speakers have referred to. So for COP26, do I think that's going to happen? No. Do I think that the future is getting closer all the time? Yes, and maybe we'll start to act, but I'm not particularly hopeful that our politicians get it yet, to be honest.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Amee, let me just come to you, just with to start to wrap this up, just with a similar question. Where do you see the hope, or do you? Should maybe be the question, and your message to the COP.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything the speakers have said before. I think, everything they've said is exactly what I was thinking. I think, for COP, it depends on how these leaders are going to act. Are they going to just, give us the talk, which again can only get us so far? Or are they going to leave their egos at the door and, move forward with actual actionable steps, taking into account everything that, all the speakers have said? Do I think that it's going to happen this time? I think I'm very similar with Mark, that I don't think so, but I'd like to hope so. And, as the kind of younger generation, I think that's all we've got is a little bit of hope, that we'll all do our best. But again, it's up to the higher power, right, to make those systematic changes. So, holding on to hope.
Well, maybe that's a kind of a point that, despite how, really quite perilous the situation is that we're in, and so many unbelievable kind of complexities and challenges, that we do kind of need to hold on to hope. Listen, I would love to have actually kept this conversation going a lot longer. Really fantastic, and such richness to the discussion as well, and so many key messages there around design and systems thinking. Leaders needing to ask themselves, what perspectives are we holding on to? That vital importance of Indigenous knowledge, and also about actually what we should be focusing on is a just transition. So thank you to all of you. I have absolutely no doubt that you have concentrated the minds of everyone that's been listening to this session today. So thank you to Rachel, to Amee, to Mark and Samantha. Incredibly grateful for your time today.
I'm absolutely delighted to be here taking part in this conference, which is addressing some really big and important issues, not just about the future of Scotland, but of course the future path that the world needs to take, not least in addressing the climate emergency. I'm particularly delighted to be joined here by Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who of course is a renowned economist, former advisor to the EU Commissioner for Research, Science and Innovation, and an extremely important and valued member of the Scottish Government's Council for Economic Transformation. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you, Mariana. I hope you're well.
Thank you so much, First Minister. It's a huge delight for me always to talk with you about the nitty-gritty of getting things right. So thanks so much for inviting me.
Excellent. I mean, obviously, we are, I hope, and I say this with my fingers crossed, beginning to emerge from a global pandemic, or at least the acute phase of a global pandemic. And that over the past 18 months has felt like, you know, the biggest challenge that humanity has faced, certainly in our lifetimes. And to some extent that has been true. But of course, as we emerge from the pandemic, how we recover really matters. And we face another massive challenge, which is the climate emergency and tackling this journey to net zero and making sure that we make that transition, but also that we make that transition in a just way. That's a massive priority and undertaking for the Scottish Government. And I know it is part of the thinking in your new book, which is Mission Economy, a moonshot guide to changing capitalism, which sounds...
Do you have a copy?
Just as thought-provoking. You send me a copy of all of your books, and I've started to read it as well, which I haven't finished reading it yet. But it sounds just as thought-provoking as all of your books have been. And the thinking, the economic thinking in all of your books, of course, is very much at the heart of the Scottish Government's economic thinking too. But can we kick off maybe just by giving you the opportunity to say a bit more about the themes of the book and the key messages that you're trying to get across, and how you think that what you're saying in the book is timely and necessary for the scale and the nature of the challenge we face right now.
Sure. And, thank you so much for actually putting it into that context, because you talked about the need to not just return to normal, to some kind of growth, but really to be very specific and have a global conversation of not only what's gone wrong, but how we need to design our economic system so it really does build radically much better, forward better, not just back better. And so the book and some of my other writings are really about that. That's not going to happen on its own. It's not just about government coming in and being, say, counter-cyclical, putting money in when we're in a recession and then hoping for the best. We actually need to really redesign the policies themselves, the framings, the underlying assumptions, but also the associated institutions, the public organizations of the future really need to be rethought. And the tools that we have available, whether it's procurement policy, grants, loans, or of course, what I worked so closely with your government on, the design of a public bank, the Scottish National Investment Bank. What does it mean to design an institution of that sort? So it really helps us to build forwards much better so that we actually get growth that's more inclusive and more sustainable. And the key thesis in the book is that we've kind of gotten it wrong. We keep going from crisis to crisis. You mentioned the climate crisis. We're currently under, this incredibly tragic health pandemic, which is especially tragic for many parts of the developing world, which still don't have access even to a first vaccine jab. And of course, the financial crisis, we're actually still structuring our economy so that we might have another financial crisis very soon. In the UK, for example, the ratio of private debt to disposable income is back at the level it was just before the financial crisis. And that's what caused it, right? So financial, climate, health, we can't keep just patching up the system and waiting for crisis to occur to get government to kind of step up and get business to step up. So what the book does is it kind of goes backwards 51 years ago to when we did something so difficult, which was getting to the moon and back, that kind of moon landing, the Apollo mission. And obviously the kind of challenges we have today, which are social, societal, deeply behavioral and wicked challenges, are much harder than going to the moon, but there's some really interesting lessons there. What it actually meant for policy to be designed with a really clear target. It wasn't just the space race. It wasn't, just beat the Russians. It was going to the moon and back within a concrete time period, within a generation is what they set themselves out. And what it meant for the design of policy, but especially, and this is something I don't think people talk about enough with the moon landing, the design of the public-private partnership. Because it wasn't just the state. There was huge numbers of different types of businesses in different sectors as different as nutrition, textiles, materials, electronics, software, obviously aeronautics. But the way these different sectors came together under government leadership, government wasn't micromanaging the process, but definitely directed it, crowding in all sorts of bottom-up innovation, but it didn't just happen on its own. It meant that NASA, for example, had to be very careful to change how things had been done before then. So they changed the procurement process to be not just cost plus procurement, but fixed price. So there was almost like a prize that was offered to businesses with incentives for quality improvement and innovation. And they realized that they needed to redesign procurement along that kind of, fixed price with quality improvement structures in order to galvanize and crowd in as much innovation as possible, but also to keep the costs relatively contained. And they even wrote into the contracts no excess profits, which I just found so interesting, right? In other words, if we're going to do this together, let's not make this into a gambling casino. Profits are fine, but given that it's collectively created in terms of that kind of incredible effort by so many different types of actors in the public and private sphere, what does it mean to not just share the risks, but also the rewards? And lastly, just to give you sort of a sense of kind of some of the interesting details, one of the things I found so interesting, and it really relates to the work that I've done with your government, the head of procurement in NASA at the time, Ernest Brackett, he was very aware that in order to partner in a dynamic, creative way with the private sector, government itself had to be intelligent, had to keep investing within its own, what I call dynamic capabilities of the public sector. And he said, if we don't do that, if NASA doesn't do that, it would get captured by what he called brochuremanship. In other words, they wouldn't even know which private sector actors to work with, how to write the terms of reference, and maybe get captured just by some sexy brochure, shiny brochure. Today we would have PowerPoints. And so that idea that both business and government need to be investing within their own institutions, be dynamic, agile, and flexible. And that was one of the first big changes they made in NASA. They changed their organizational structure because after also one of the biggest tragedies they had with the Apollo 1 fire, where one of the astronauts before dying said, how the hell are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Because he couldn't hear what was being said to him in the mission control room. That made them really rethink the bureaucracy itself within NASA to make it much more horizontal, creative, agile, and flexible. And I think all those different lessons about kind of, government having a clear direction, but not micromanaging, working with lots of different sectors, but rewriting the tools and the policies to crowd in lots of innovation, but for a clear public purpose, and investing within our bureaucracy so that they are capable and you don't have to outsource all the knowledge. All those are just hugely relevant today.
That's absolutely fascinating. I mean, you've addressed what was one of the questions I was going to ask you, because the moon landings, which I should say happened just before I was born, the scale of the challenge and the achievement of that is off the scale. But it was a single project, and so my question was going to be: is the learning from that really relevant to the complexity and the multi-layered nature of the challenges that the world faces right now? But I think you've really powerfully there and very vividly set out how those lessons absolutely are applicable. Partnership and collaboration are key, and they are themes that run through all of your writing. And you've referenced already the Scottish National Investment Bank, which is very much about government, public sector and private sector working together, government taking the risk, but also getting more of the benefits. And I just wonder, how do we, because if I reflect on the era, certainly that I've grown up in and practiced politics and government in, we have a mindset that too often sees government, public sector and private sector as competitors. They don't understand each other. Depending on your perspective, you see one is good and the other is bad, and often putting barriers in each other's way. But if we're to address the challenges we face, that collaboration and partnership is so critical. How do we start? I mean, some of the most powerful things I hear you say, and you've just illustrated it there, is use examples. I've heard you talking about, the iPhone seen as something that is a success of the private sector, couldn't have happened without government investment in research. How do we change that mindset? How do we get people much, much more understanding of the need to do economies differently and for collaboration and partnership to be much more the norm?
Well, thanks for that question. And if I can just go back to something you just said before asking the question, which is also how the Apollo mission is different actually from the societal challenges we have today. Just want to highlight and reemphasize it's extremely different. And so those lessons that I talked about, however, I think are applicable today. But what's not applicable is, as you say, it was just kind of one big project. Whereas if you look at all the different challenges we have around climate change, inequality, strengthening our health systems, they require just as much technological change as organizational change, social change, regulatory change, behavioral change. And that is much, much harder. That's what we mean when we use the word wicked problems. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore that kind of massive restructuring that we require within public institutions and the redesigning of the tools to be outcomes focused instead of just kind of handing out money. And that's why the Scottish National Investment Bank was so interesting, because it's not just about setting up a public bank. That's not enough. In Italy, where I'm from, we have a public bank, which unfortunately has, at least in history, often just been handing out money to whichever sector or firm asks for it, often sectors that are in trouble. So if you're just handing out money to sectors that are in trouble without guiding and directing those sectors to transform themselves towards, really important social goals, then that's not the right function of the bank. So recently, for example, we looked a lot at the German public bank called the KfW, which, because there was a very clear mission on the top around their energy transformation called Energiewende, the kind of support that the public bank provided to the steel sector, which globally is asking for help, often asking to be bailed out, was actually conditional. They created a conditionality for the steel sector to transform itself, to lower its material content in order to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And they did that by engaging with new kind of innovative practices around repurpose, reuse, recycle technology across the whole value chain of steel production. And they today have one of the most sustainable and innovative steel production methods in the world, not because they went to Davos and talked about stakeholder value, but because they had to do it in order to get one penny from the government. And that's exactly the kind of thinking that we had with the Scottish National Investment Bank, which is start with the big challenges, turn them into missions, and then what is the role of a public bank to provide the patient, long-term committed finance that's required in order to find those solutions, whether they be around the digital divide or climate. But that kind of ideological backdrop that you're mentioning, which is that we keep then somehow painting this picture of government at best as fixing market failures. That's the economist talk. At best, kind of patching things up. You have to wait for a crisis before you do something big. We need to change that. And one of the ways to change that is precisely as you were saying, to just change how we're even painting the picture of government as just a regulator, a fixer, an administrator, whereas all the interesting entrepreneurial creativity, innovation is depicted as being inside the private sector. And so that's why I wrote that first book called The Entrepreneurial State, using different examples, including the iPhone example, which, it's not that the iPhone was created by the state, but all the technology that makes it smart and not stupid was in fact state funded. Then we needed a really innovative, private sector company like Apple to apply its ideas of simplicity and design to create these wonderful products that everyone wants. But without those state-funded technologies, they would be creating sexy, stupid phones, not smartphones. So, you know, you need both private and public, but how we then design that partnership, that's really what the book tries to focus on, in some ways in a very detailed way, by looking exactly at how, you know, NASA warned that if they themselves stop investing in their own brain, they wouldn't even know how to partner with business and they wouldn't themselves be entrepreneurial. And I do think that's a huge problem. And if I can be really frank, also within Scotland, definitely many different countries where I'm currently working, this kind of over-reliance, for example, on consulting companies, you know, whether it's PwC, Deloitte, KPMG, to, for example, do the project management. Because, you know, even with the Scottish National Investment Bank, there was, you know, quite a bit of a consulting company activity. And I remember that when we talked about it, I think it was actually directly with you, First Minister, and I hope you don't mind if I'm just being so frank about this, but it's a global issue. I mean, every single government I work with has this. I think you mentioned, yeah, but that's just the project management side. And one of the things I'm trying to do is to say, actually, that matters. How we manage, how we do matters, because then government learns by doing. If we outsource some of the doing, and so much of the doing, to the private sector, we don't have that kind of trial and error and learning by doing experience within the state. And so the state itself eventually, you know, within the organizations and the civil service, is missing out on the kind of intelligence and learning that's acquired. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't use consulting companies or outsourcing anything. Of course, that's always going to be part of the formula, but really making sure that we're careful on what's being outsourced, but especially investing within the learning capacity of the civil service and being careful to not do what I think Lord Agnew said recently in the UK government. He said that this over-reliance on outsourcing, which he saw both with Brexit and COVID, was infantilizing Whitehall, he said. And I quote this in the book. I think that's a real huge global problem, that on the one hand, yes, let's be careful not to depict this black and white dichotomy of the state as boring and the, you know, private sector is doing all the creativity. But on the other hand, be aware that you might become boring. You might become more and more just purely bureaucratic if you're not actually being careful to invest within your own dynamic capabilities.
No, I mean, this question, and you and I have discussed this directly, of the capacity and capability of government is one that, you know, I grapple with and think about every day. But it's also a really good example of the mindset and the narrative being almost counter to what you are, in my view, in a very compelling way, saying we need to do. Because the narrative over long, you know, periods now, certainly in Scotland and in the UK, I suspect across much of the Western world, has been about, you know, government should be smaller, government should be leaner, you know, we should be reducing the amount of investment in civil servants and governments, and the impact of that is reducing the capability and increasing the dependence on outsourcing in the private sector. So it's a good example, I think, of how, if we're going to do what you are, in my view, rightly advising we should be trying to do, we have to shift all of that and turn all of that in its head. And there's a challenge for, if I can be frank, business and the private sector as well, because sometimes they are the loudest voice, putting pressure on, or one of the loudest voices putting pressure on government to downsize and downscale. So it's about really trying to change the conversation, understanding the respective roles, but putting more of an emphasis on government as an enabler, but also as a key partner. And I think there's a big challenge there in order to get onto the practical side of what we need to change as well.
But you know what's so interesting about what you've said, which I 100% agree with, is that it also goes both ways. On the one hand, when you have all this emphasis of just getting government to be kind of more efficient, using these really static efficiency measures and kind of assuming that government should just stick to fixing markets and get out of the way, that can lead to this kind of austerity mindset of just kind of cutting as much as you can. So when you have a reform of public administration, it's actually just a cut. So it doesn't even then have the resources to become more innovative. But there's also the opposite extreme, which is, just look today, where there's huge amounts in some countries, not all, of public money going into the system, again, on the back of a huge crisis. In the US, you know, over 2 trillion. In Europe with the European Recovery Scheme, over $1 trillion. euros. And if we don't then just step back and say, okay, great, there's going to be a recovery fund as opposed to austerity. But if we don't think through the structures, the redesign of the tools, the redesign of the institutions, like our discussion about the Scottish National Investment Bank, then it's a wasted opportunity. You will just flood the system with liquidity, as we did after the financial crisis. Most of that money just went back into the financial sector. And we can't risk doing that again, especially given the scale of the current pandemic. But the other thing, just coming back to the austerity situation, which unfortunately, by the way, I think will be coming back because many countries are obviously, on the back of the recovery, also seeing the public debt numbers go up, and we have to avoid that under all circumstances, to have austerity on the back of a pandemic, as we know that the pandemic was worse than it had to be because of cuts to things like health services. What we need to always remember is that austerity is not only bad for kind of social reasons. Again, cutting health services, public education, public transport is bad for society, but it's even bad for the public budget. What I've seen in countries that just focus on the deficit, like Italy again, or Greece, Spain, Portugal after the financial crisis, is ironically their debt to GDP ratios increased because they were just doing these blanket cuts. They were just focusing on reducing public expenditure, which then had a long run cost to it. A long run cost in terms of all the things that government has to then invest and spend in to pick up the mess that's created when you don't have that, dynamic and strategic public and private investment. So that's really the irony, that instead of thinking about short-term deficits, by thinking about long-term growth and really galvanizing and catalyzing both public and private sector investment, that's the best way to keep down debt to GDP instead of thinking about short-run deficits.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think austerity is not just wrong in principle, but counterproductive. And even what we've just been talking about there, the capacity of government. If I think about the Scottish civil service, it's smaller than it was pre-austerity. It's got less in terms of scale. It still does a fantastic job, I should say, but we've lost a lot because of the need, in our case, the enforced need to make crude cuts that were not in any sense forward-looking about how you protect value in the longer term. So I think that point is really well made. I mean, what we're talking about here is, is fascinating. I think the big picture of this is so important and so exciting, actually, because as we hopefully come out of the pandemic, the opportunity to rethink and reimagine how we do things to meet these challenges should be seen as an opportunity. But often, for governments, for business, the practical steps you take along the way are what are the immediate decisions lying ahead. You advise the Scottish Government, obviously, so we've got the benefit of your expertise on an ongoing basis. But if you were, I suppose there's two parts to this question. If you were to say to me as First Minister of Scotland, here's one thing, and I hate questions that ask me to reduce things to one thing, so I hate doing it to you. But we've done the Scottish National Investment Bank. What core piece of advice would you give me right now? And also, if you were sitting here as you are talking to business leaders, what does business need to do to start to shift how we do things?
So I've actually thought about that quite a bit, because I feel that Scotland has so much of the right thinking, very much led by you, First Minister. And the more we can line up and align these different interesting initiatives, the stronger the multiplier effect will be. So just one very concrete example, and I know I've said this in quite a few of our meetings, so I'll say it again now publicly. I think a really interesting innovation that Scotland could really lead on globally, so other countries could learn from, is the fact that you have something called the Business Pledge, which has these really ambitious criteria and characteristics that the government in some ways is asking business to align itself towards. And currently it's more like a club, like different businesses can sign the Business Pledge, and the different criteria are things like paying the living wage, being eco-friendly, so actually investing in those processes that will make them more sustainable, obviously paying tax and so on. But there's all sorts of actually really ambitious criteria there. Well, why not turn that into something that is less like just a voluntary club and actually use it in order to help devise what I call symbiotic public-private partnerships? Because it's not enough to partner. You know, you can have abusive partnerships, you can have predatory partnerships. So what does it mean to have a mutualistic and a symbiotic partnership between the public and private actors? What would it look like if that business pledge, for example, became one of the, coming back to this word I used before, conditions, that kind of conditionality that we require between both public and private, so that whether it's bailouts, grants, subsidies, loans through the Scottish National Investment Bank are dependent on companies actually being, in quotes, good companies. And, you know, how you define those good companies ideally would actually come from a conversation between business and the state, so they can actually get a pledge that is truly kind of co-created, but then make it mandatory. You know, let's get rid of these just voluntary kind of talk shops, make it a concrete, put it into the design of the instruments themselves. And, you know, that's just a very, I think, specific advice I'd give. Yeah. But coming back to your earlier point, often business, but also government, is, you know, part of the problem. So the fact that so much of the regressive taxation that we've had across the world is not just wrong, but was lobbied for by particular businesses, that's exactly the opposite of what I'm talking about when I think of symbiotic partnership, including in my own area, which is innovation. I've, you know, talked a lot about why the patent box, I don't know how much the viewers know what this is, but the patent box policy, which is a reduction in tax based on patents that firms have, why that makes no sense, because patents are already a 20-year monopoly. You're giving a 20-year monopoly to a company. There's no reason then to reduce the tax on a 20-year monopoly profit. And if you look at, you know, particular companies have lobbied for that, and actually it's created very little additionality in terms of getting investment to happen that wouldn't have happened anyway. So again, using also metrics of additionality on how we can not only design conditionality through something like the business pledge into a public-private partnership, but then ex post, look at the effect that these policies and tools and new instruments have had in terms of really galvanizing investment that wouldn't have happened anyway. And, you know, again, that would be also something I'd really ask you to focus on, because otherwise there's, again, a missed opportunity. We have all this great thinking, but it doesn't actually lead to substantial change. And this is something we've been working on with also the Green Book, and that the UK government uses to evaluate public investments. Too often they're based on kind of public choice theory ideas of net present value and cost benefit analysis. And yet all these kind of missions and challenge oriented policies that I've worked on with your government require on the back of those policies just as much innovation on how we evaluate how you've done, right? So making sure that we capture all the dynamic spillovers. You know, getting to the moon and back was not just an achievement that they did that, but along the way, so many different innovations happened that they didn't even expect to happen, including the whole software industry in some ways was a spillover. Well, how do you capture that? How do you look at those dynamic spillovers between all these different sectors? And again, you know, that itself would also be really important, I think, for the government.
It's really good advice, I think, and you know, on the conditionality point, we are you'll be glad to hear, moving to build much more conditionality into the business pledge, and you know, the relationships we have between public funding and the kind of economy we're trying to build. But that point about the Green Book is crucial, because often we stifle a lot of our ability to do the things we're talking about by the rules we attach right at the outset, and the Scottish Government is bound by that as well. So building in much longer term thinking, your point, and I think this is a key one for us as well, about evaluating down the line what the impact of investments or interventions have been, and also how we capture value, what it is we're measuring. So I think all that is good advice for us, and hopefully for the business leaders listening to this. We're running out of time, so probably only got time for one more question. I want to ask you, I suppose you obviously advise the Scottish Government, you interact with governments elsewhere in the world. Are you optimistic just now that there's a mindset and an appetite to really step up and do what needs to be done and change how things are done, not just within different countries, but between countries, because collaboration on some of this needs to be international. You know, we're about to host COP26 in Glasgow in a few weeks' time. you know, we've had Brexit, of course, taking perhaps the UK outside of some of that European collaboration. So how would you sum up your mood at the moment? Or do you think the world is, or the leaders of the world have what it takes to take us through the next period and actually address these challenges?
So, you know, it's very much of a mixed picture. When I look at some things, like, for example, that the European recovery is actually conditional on member states actually having a climate plan and a digital divide plan, very different from what happened after the financial crisis, where the European recovery was conditional on austerity. That makes me, you know, very hopeful. And I think it really has been a huge step change, at least for how the European Union, which I, as you mentioned before, work with a lot. I've also seen this in the US, where the Biden team, I was just speaking to them yesterday, the Council of Economic Advisors, they also have put in, you know, types of, again, conditionalities and a focus on the infrastructure plan that they have now to make sure that it's a green infrastructure plan and not just more cement and bricks and roads. But on the other hand, when I look at the tragedy, which Dr. Tedros, who I work with closely now because I'm chairing the WHO's Council on the Economy, you know, what we currently have is what he calls vaccine apartheid. We have, you know, 80% of the doses being hoarded by 10% of countries. You have even the vaccines that have been produced in South Africa have been, you know, exported outside of Africa. And the fact that we don't have any kind of strong common good criteria to make sure that at least now during a health pandemic, we actually make sure that we truly understand that we're only as healthy as our neighbor is, and make sure that we also structure intellectual property rights in such a way that we don't have so much value extraction within the production of the vaccines themselves. If we can't do it with something as important as the vaccine and make sure that the world is vaccinated, then, you know, we're not going to do it for other areas that are less urgent. And so, you know, the fact that there hasn't been enough solidarity, that there hasn't been enough also ambition within businesses like Pfizer, by the way, which very differently from AstraZeneca didn't agree to some of the, asks basically from the World Health Organization around intellectual property rights. AstraZeneca, because it was in an Oxford University project with publicly funded researchers, there was much stronger conditions, again, attached both to the costs of the vaccine and to the intellectual property rights, which just shows you, again, that it's not just about business and government. It's at the project level we need to get this right, and we need to learn from what works and what doesn't. So anyway, I know that was a bit of a ramble, but I just want to say that there's some really positive things happening, and we need to scale those lessons up. And the negative things like vaccine apartheid, we need to stop that. We need to absolutely change the way that the world currently is producing and distributing vaccines in order to make sure that we do not lose this opportunity to make sure that we're not making this health pandemic even worse than it has to be.
Well, thanks. I think lots of food for thought for all of us in that, including governments like the Scottish Government, particularly your points about vaccination. You know, this is a global pandemic. We're not going to be out of it until everybody is out of it. So I think wise words there. Mariana, it's always really stimulating to speak with you. So thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today. I'm sure everybody has really enjoyed that. I think we're very fortunate in Scotland to have the benefit of your advice to the Scottish Government, and I look forward to taking advantage of that for as long as you're prepared to share it with us. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for everything that you do, and I hope everybody is interested and excited on the back of this, and will go off and read your book so that we can, in a much more complex way, recreate the spirit of the moon landings over the period to come. Thank you.
I'm sure, like many of you, you get a lot of invites to a lot of conferences, and usually, if you're lucky, there'll be one truly challenging viewpoint out of a sea of platitudes. And if I'm going to be really honest, I thought maybe this might be more of the same, but actually it's been such an invigorating space. I've been really challenged, and I hope you have too, not just by the speakers, but also by the really interesting chat that's been going on over on the Hop-In platform. As someone who is a board trustee of a youth climate charity, I'm often struck by how many people look to the youth for hope. It's a bit troubling to think that we look to a demographic group that has the most limited power and agency to hold the rest of us accountable. We heard from Vanessa Nakate, who explained that there's a difference between hearing and listening. We absolutely know that we cannot eat coal and we cannot drink oil, yet we continue to design systems that exploit our people and our planet. Maybe it's just because I work in the resource management sector, but it seems like in recent years, the single-use bottle has become the global symbol of our linear exploitative economy. So what I'd like to add to Aidan's sort of actionable points is to ask the business leaders here today to think outside of the symbolic single-use bottle rather than the box. So think outside of that plastic bottle. None of this is an individualistic or consumer problem. It's about thinking outside of the bottle as a challenge to businesses producing goods and services to consider how your organisations would function without our planet doing the heavy lifting. How does your business work within a circular economy? How does your business work in a truly just world? Earlier today, Samantha made a very smooth reference to, oh gosh, I'm going to try and say it, purple burglar alarm, which made me laugh out loud. If you don't get the reference, please go and look it up. And I just want to thank her for that, because as we address really difficult global challenges, it's important to remember that you're allowed to laugh, you're allowed to play. Achieving climate justice isn't just hard work, it's heart work, so we need to look after each other. And earlier today on the break, I actually had a change of clothes and went out for a run. And I would encourage everybody to get outside, because one of my favourite writers, Rebecca Solnit, talks about walking as how the body measures itself against the earth. And perhaps if we're outside more, engaging with our communities and living in our local environments, we can think through some of those bigger, complex, wicked problems. So the final ask that I have of everybody here today is that, for me, as someone who's in the charity sector as a trustee, I've learned that actually only 3% of charity trustees are under 30 years old. So I'd ask everyone here today to go back to your organisations and your businesses and work out what the average age of your board is. Take a good look at who's around you and who has a say in decision making within your company, and ask yourself what experience means to you. Is it all about age? Or can actually, as we've seen today, some of the more youthful voices actually invigorate the conversation and bring new ideas and hopefully solutions to the table?